Thank you so much for joining us. My name's Dan, and this is Ajaye and Matt. We have got just under an hour to cover, I'll read this out to remind us all, battling for the ownership of the UK's new social infrastructure. My job is to explain the most boring part of that sentence, so what is social infrastructure, to set the scene, and then I'll be very pleased to hand over to Ajaye and Matt to give us a bit of a wider perspective into what we're talking about today. So, as I say, really pleased to be here. Thank you, Johnny, for giving me the chance to explore some of this work, and for Matt for kicking it off initially. So, just a little introduction. I do a range of different things, writing long, boring documents, policy, research, sometimes at Social Enterprise UK, sometimes writing for other organisations or doing research either locally here in the Southwest or around the world, sometimes little bits of research for Matt, a local trust, writing in StirToAction now and again. And a few years ago, probably 7 or 8 years ago now, I was fortunate enough that Matt was happy to indulge me because I wanted to write something and do some research on what many people kind of call roughly social infrastructure. This largely started from, I guess I was reading articles in the newspaper or reading people bemoaning the death and the decline of certain types of places and spaces that were important to them. So we might have read about the death of the British pub, or the closure of local post offices, or skittle alleys don't seem to be a thing anymore, and so on. And I kind of spent a little while Googling these and said, well, someone must have sort of added these all up and looked and said, well, all this stuff, that bingo halls, either sort of Victorian institutions or post-war institutions, or more recent things like Shore Starts, things that we were used to having, libraries that had closed down. And I kind of kept Googling, there must be a list of all this stuff somewhere. And you could only find, like, I don't know, the post office sort of newspaper talking about post office closures, or the Publican talking about pub closures, but I couldn't find them all together. So Matt, luckily, I was really happy to be able to produce a report for Local Trust on the decline of social infrastructure in the UK. And I think it's maybe an interesting report for some of us, but for most people, actually, there's only one bit that matters. It's page 11 or something, and we listed out all, I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, but 10,000 pubs have closed, 400 post offices, 152 libraries, or whatever it was. It was all listed out on one page, and that was really what the report was about, was putting all these things in one place. And since then, there's been more and more talk of like social infrastructure. What does it mean? Is it important? What's its role in building social capital? Playing into policy around things like community ownership fund and levelling up, and so on and so on. So that was great, and I was really pleased to do that. Then I sort of started to think, okay, maybe this was a little bit dishonest, actually, and I've sort of presented this picture, and actually I'm not sure it's the whole picture. And if we look around us, and I was basically thinking about how do I spend my weekends with my young kids, I found that actually I was spending a lot of my time at weekends on light industrial estates at like a soft play centre, or a trampoline park or something, or maybe if I was lucky I could leave them there and I could go around the corner to the tap room at the microbrewery. But it sort of seemed to be these new things that weren't there 30 years ago. We didn't have trampoline parks in the same way, or skate parks or climbing walls in quite the same way. And I think Matt was very wise in refusing to fund me to do that, because it was a bit of a ridiculous sort of hobby of mine. But Johnny was kind to say, yeah, why don't you do a little piece on it in StirToAction. So actually, I'm just going to read out some of the numbers that I found, which again was bringing all these things together in one place. So you might find articles about the rise of climbing walls, but actually, let's put all these things together. So my brief research said that actually, and these are all roughly things that we didn't kind of have, I don't know, 25, 30, 40 years ago in the same way in the UK, but we have many of them now. So apparently now we have 1,600 skate parks, we have 450 climbing walls, 7,000 health and fitness clubs or gyms, 4,400 and something Pilates and yoga studios, 1,500 mosques, 200 or 300 gurdwaras, 6,000 martial arts schools, clubs or dojos, I think they're called, over 1,000 soft play centre operators, 200 trampoline parks, 300 10-pin bowling centres. They are a bit older, but they kind of died and then came back again. 1,500 escape rooms, 600 men's sheds, 4,000 nail salons. They weren't really a thing sort of 30, 40 years ago in the same way. And 3,000 sort of active breweries that might have tap rooms or places that you can go and get sample some of the beer. So I kind of have listed that out in an article for Johnny, and I feel like I've sort of addressed the fact that the first piece of work probably wasn't completely honest. Then reflecting on those, it seems that actually some of these places and spaces where people spend their time, where they interact, where they might meet people in their community, where they go, instead of going to the places that they may have used to have gone 50, 60 years ago, the churches, the village halls, some of these places are sort of problematic in some ways. I might enjoy going there sometimes, but actually we should be asking about what are the nature of these places and how do they bring us together. So if they're all on light industrial estates and you need a car to get there and they're all got sort of middle-class white blokes with beards in them, that's not okay, really. That sort of requires a bit of asking questions around the new places and spaces that we're spending our time. So that's kind of led us to where we are today. And I've also, the final part of the picture, I think, is looking at who owns and controls these spaces. And one of the reasons why people got really angry about post offices and pubs closing, for example, was because the communities themselves didn't really seem to have any say in this happening. So you might find that a pub chain somewhere on a spreadsheet decided that this pub was the one that wasn't lucrative and it didn't stack up, and that was the one they were going to close, and the local community just found overnight it had closed down and they had no influence or say in that happening. And I wonder then about these new social spaces that have emerged over the last couple of decades. Who owns and controls them? Does the community get any say in how they run, when they're open, who goes in them, who can use them, how accessible they are, how inclusive they are? Or are they also owned and controlled by remote interests, by private interests? And it seems that most of them are generally in private ownership, with some charitable and social ownership, community ownership, cooperative ownership as well, in contrast to maybe some of the old waves of infrastructure that were, to some extent, publicly influenced and controlled. So that's my introduction. I'll leave that for now. But actually, Ajaye is involved in actually doing stuff and running things and doing real work, not just pontificating on it like me. Matt does pontificate on things as well, so we can have a bit of balance on the panel. But I'm really pleased to hand over initially to these two to introduce their work and how it relates to this agenda about new social spaces. So just, please introduce yourself and tell us about what you do, Ajaye.
I'm much happier stood up as well, so I'm going to stand up at the same time. My name's Ajaye. I'm the CEO and founder of a company called the Project PT. We run community-based gyms. We set up our gym to address the 85% of the people that didn't go to gyms. So those of you who were at the talk previously about investment, trying to get investment in a gym that wants to work with people who don't go to gyms was really, really good fun. So I paid quite close attention to that conversation. Alongside the work that we do working with people who felt alienated and disenfranchised from gyms, we also run social impact projects. Those social impact projects work with young people who are vulnerable to child criminal exploitation. So those who feel disenfranchised with the education system, who are deemed to be NEETs or on the periphery of becoming NEETs, so not in education, employment and training. Alongside those programs, we also work with young girls who are disengaged with physical activity, so who move into that secondary school hemisphere where they are scared to participate in sports, where body changes are starting to happen, and where their life sort of starts to change for them. We take them into male-dominated spaces, so we coach them in boxing, and we coach them in skateboarding, and we show them the power that sport can have and the opportunities that they can have if they actually take that extra step and step through into there. So hopefully today I'll be able to speak to you about what skate parks look like, what multi-use game areas look like, or muggers for those of you who know, but also what gyms need to do in order to feel and to be as inclusive as possible. I think most importantly for me is the focus for me on this conversation also needs to be that we can't be as inclusive as we want to be. Our core value as a company, our second core value, our first is kindness, our second is inclusivity. But I think we all have to be honest and say that every single space cannot be fully inclusive. Every single space is going to have some version of a limitation. My gym, the limitation there is the financial limitation. We need to charge a certain amount in order for us to be able to run the services that we run. In order for us to be able to run those services, we have to put the gyms into certain areas, which means that actually sometimes physical disability can't always be addressed as well as we would like it to be. So I think my takeaway, I'm zooming to the end of this conversation, but the takeaway is us thinking about what are our limitations and do we understand how inclusive we are trying to be and what we can't sort of do. I'll let Matt introduce himself next.
Thanks. So I'm Matt. I run something called Local Trust, which for the last decade or more now has been, I guess, overseeing, enabling, being part of a quite remarkable social experiment. It's an experiment to see what happens when you simply put money and power in the hands of local people. And in 150 communities across the country, often peripheral communities, many of them highly deprived, we went in 2012 with lottery money and said, you, the residents of this estate, this neighbourhood, you can have £1 million, you can spend it on whatever you want. There are no rules, there are no constraints. All you've got to do is get together with your neighbours, come up with a plan, and then get on with doing something. And right across the country, we've seen amazing things happen. Some of the people who've done those amazing things, Ralph near the front here, from Sale West, comes from one such community. We've seen communities come together, build new social fabric, new community organisations, take on assets, and start to put in place in communities that often had been socially hollowed out, the sort of social infrastructure, the scaffolding that's needed for any community to succeed and thrive. And actually, there are quite a lot of big locals at this conference today. And that's quite unusual, I guess, or it would have been unusual 10 years ago, because many of the communities that big locals set up shop in were places that simply didn't have much community organisation to start with. They were identified because they were places that hadn't had their fair share of lottery money. They hadn't had their fair share of lottery money because there weren't community organisations there to ask for it. It was a kind of almost hidden, invisible axis of inequality that went above and beyond deprivation, where deprivation was compounded by a lack of social organisation, which meant that the sorts of things that many communities benefit from, they didn't. And actually, it's an issue that still exists now. If you look at the stats over the last 20 years, consistently, the big funders, including the lottery, provide about 3 times as much funding to the most deprived communities in general as they do to the equally deprived communities who lack social fabric. So the places that don't have the community centres, that don't have the craft sessions, that don't have the community-led residents groups, simply don't get a chance to catch up. They fall further behind. And what the programme has done has provided an incredible window. I'm primarily gained just by the privilege of going and listening to people, the privilege of understanding what it is that makes a difference to people's lives, particularly in the most deprived and disadvantaged places. And overwhelmingly, when you listen to people and you stand back and you see what they've done, you find that people prioritise places to meet and stuff to do in them. Sometimes, when we've done surveys, we employed Survation to go out and survey those communities. We found that actually people in poor communities often prioritise places to meet and stuff to do above jobs, because the big gap in their lives, as well as a financial gap, is that gap around relationships, around networks, around the stuff that gives you identity, connection, reciprocal obligation, all the stuff that makes being a human a thing. And we started, and this is we probably started actually when Dan started on his journey, trying to understand what that meant. We did a lot of work mapping, crunching data, trying to understand what it was about places to meet, about community-led organisations that was particularly important, and particularly important to the experience of life in our most deprived communities. And what we found was that if you map the overlap between deprivation and social infrastructure, the places to meet, the community organisations that bring people together, you see a really interesting picture. I mean, a really quite challenging picture. You see that the places in which, if you just take the lowest 10% of the index of multiple deprivation as a kind of rough sort of guide to where to go, you see the places that have social fabric there to start with have significantly lower levels of obesity, significantly lower levels of mental ill health. You see the people who live in communities that don't have social fabric have much poorer life outcomes in terms of education, opportunity, experience of crime. There's a complete additional axis of advantage or disadvantage that has been largely unacknowledged in social policy, certainly for the last 30 years, and certainly since the abandonment of any serious neighbourhood investment programmes, probably at the end of the 2000s. So as an organisation, we've been trying to do something about it. We've written lots of policy papers. We've employed lots of equally bald-headed policy wonks like me to expand the knowledge field further. We've campaigned for dormant assets to be moved from stuff like social finance to, frankly, recapitalising the social fabric of communities that need it most. And I think I'll step back and let sort of Dan take things forward somewhat. But it does feel to me that over the last 30 to 40 years, we've had a model a social model which has tolerated the destruction of shared workplaces, trade unions, all the stuff that went with that, the working men's clubs, the bingo halls, the things that brought communities together. Often it happened because of the deindustrialisation. The money went out of communities. People lost jobs. They didn't go to the Miners' Institute, which meant that then the social facilities that were funded by that disappeared. And we came in with universal credit and housing benefit to make sure that people didn't absolutely starve. And then we sent in social care and mental health services to cope with the fact that people often in communities were suffering from loneliness and isolation that came from that disintegration of social fabric and perhaps from a loss of purpose and identity and status. But we never did anything about all the other stuff that had been lost, the kind of the scaffolding of social capital that's so important. And I'm just going to finish with two bits of research that I read recently that struck me hugely. One that we picked up as we were doing work with a major local authority looking at a social capital strategy for the local authority area, a local authority that's in danger of going bust because it puts so many kids into care. And those kids that it puts into care cost it £250,000 a year each. And together that adds up to a £200 million black hole in their finances. When you look at evidence from the United States from about 15 years ago, it shows that for every 1% difference in social capital networks surrounding a family, you have a 30% change in the propensity for domestic abuse and violent conduct affecting that child. So if you're worried about local authorities going bust and you're worried about kids going into care, the starting point is probably not to make those services more efficient. It's to think about how you build social capital-rich communities in which kids don't get abused. On a slightly different note, I occasionally read right-wing think tank reports, not just Dan's reports. And as a really good report in 2020 by the American Enterprise Institute, which was kind of the think tank for the US Republican Party before it went completely mad. And they did this big survey of American life to try and understand what it was that made people feel they lived in a normal place. And their idea, it's a conservative idea, but actually it's an idea we could all share, is most people don't want to be heroes, they don't want to be special, they just want to live normal lives in normal places, non-traumatized lives in which they can thrive. And the biggest determinant, irrespective of income, of whether or not you felt you lived in a community that was normal, was whether there was a place near your house you could go to where you recognised people and there were people there who recognised you. And they called it the cheers factor, which was, it was a good slogan. But I think it gets to the fundamental of what it is to be an individual living in a community. The stuff that's really important. The stuff that's really important isn't like the architecture of social finance. It's not the kind of democratic participation or reimagining of the state. It's the relationships that people have with their neighbours, or the person across the street, or the person with a shared interest who lives somewhere nearby. And that stuff's gone. Actually, one further bit of wonky stats, Dan, and I definitely will shut up, was some work done by a PhD student in London 2 years ago, looking at mapping the rise of the far right in wards across England. And what she found was that there was a really marked association between the disappearance of pubs and the rise of the far right. And her idea, she tried to think, well, what's causing that? And she suggested that when you go to a place that's near you, you mix with people who, what you have in common with them is that you live in the same place and nothing else. So you build a much broader set of relationships, and you live a life which is naturally more inclusive and naturally more diverse. When that stuff doesn't exist, when those places to go don't exist, you retreat to your home, you go online, you get sucked into bubbles, you get radicalized, and you suffer from all of the stuff that comes from being lonely and isolated yourself. So if we want to turn communities around, we need more community centres, we need more pubs, we need more of all the things that Dan's talked about. Of course, we also need to make them accessible, and perhaps that's the challenge for us all. How do we have a soft play area on every estate?
Thank you, Matt. Thank you. So the title of this session is suggesting there's some kind of battle or fight here. So it seems that we've lost some stuff that was important to us. There's some new stuff that's emerging, but should we be paying more attention to it and asking questions about how it's run, who's involved, who can access it, how does it feel as a welcoming space or not to people, and who determines its future? So Ajaye, you've been involved with skating, with gyms, with I always call them moogers because muggers sounds like it might, but I don't know. I think
you
muggers
did, didn't you?
Yeah,
and I was like, I'm not sure whether we're talking about the same thing or not.
Multi-use games
muggers
areas, multi-use games areas. So you have actually a little sort of broader perspective here on a range of different places. Can you tell us a bit more about your experience of the sort of trade-offs with them, who's using them, and as someone that's involved in facilitating the use of them, what kind of responsibility or what thought processes are you going through with colleagues about how do we get people in here in a welcoming way, or what trade-offs and tensions do we have to think about when we're doing that?
Yeah, I think the first thing that comes to mind in the basics of accessibility is when you look at muggers, multi-use game areas, moogers, and skate parks, is that they are, a lot of the time, there are barriers around them. So whether that's a fencing or whether that's just boards all the way around, that creates a fear factor for those who want to step into that area but can't. If I take it to gyms, it's sort of more in my wheelhouse than skate parks and muggers. Gyms, so I've been in the industry for over 20 years. When I first started in the industry, free weights areas, so where you would see your dumbbells and your barbells and things, were predominantly dominated by men. They were always in a separate room. So you would have to step into that room. What happened was we saw an influx of budget gyms come into the market, so pure gyms and gym groups came through. They started to realise that actually what they needed to do was make free weights areas bigger, but also actually more accessible. So in order to do that, they stopped building those big walls and those scary doors that you have to open, and they started making it an opportunity for people to see in. What we realised when we started building our gyms was that actually if you could see in, when you were inside, you were scared that people could see in. So all of a sudden we had this challenge of, well, how do we make it so that if I'm on the outside, I can see in, but actually if I'm sat on the inside, how do I feel that I'm protected and it's okay? So there's definitely a halfway house in terms of what that needs to look like. For ourselves, we use plants, we use frosted glass that you can kind of see through in terms of the gyms. In terms of muggers, in some of the Nordic countries, what they're using is, instead of having these fences, does everyone know what we're talking about when we say muggers? Yeah, okay. So the basketball areas and, your fenced areas with your tarmac floors and stuff. In the Nordic countries, instead of having that fencing, what they're actually doing is creating a staired sort of seating arrangement instead. So you can sort of be part of it. You can sit on the periphery. You can take your time to slightly start to participate in it. In some of the new skate parks that Maverick Skate Park are building and some of the other companies, what they're doing is they're using trees and they're using plants. So again, the humans that are on the inside feel protected from it, but the humans that are on the outside feel that actually it's not that sort of scary place, and I can kind of see on the inside as well. Has anyone had any experience of feeling scared going into a free weights area, going into a skate park, going into... Yes, awesome. Do those ideas sound good to you? Yes, on how we build those inclusive spaces. Awesome.
Brilliant, thank you. Matt, do you think these are questions that funders, policymakers are thinking about? It seems to me like there's been this, everything's closed and we've lost these and we've lost that. But are we right or wrong to be saying, actually, what about skate parks? What about mogas? What about craft brewery? Maybe these are the new spaces. This is where the fight is now, to make sure that actually anyone running a gym is asking the kind of questions that Ajaye's asking about how they're accessible, and actually they're not. And maybe is that the battle? Are we right to say this might be the battleground, or is everyone still focused on the high street's dying and we've lost some post offices?
I think it depends where you look, doesn't it? And it's incredibly patchy. So you can visit communities. I did in one northern town where the mugger didn't have a fence around it because the fence had been cut down by the local dogfighting gang in order to create a pen for the fights nearby between the dogs, which seemed to be a more popular community activity than the mugger itself. But equally, you could go to the heart of Leicester if you went to the St Matthew's estate, and you'd see their pristine 3G, 4G football pitch with no fence around it at all, that's been there for 5 years, that's at the heart of a community which has a population where about 50% population is under 18, and so it's the most important thing there. And it's an estate which is, highly diverse, lots of newly arrived families there, but was right at the heart of where the riots took place in Leicester between different communities 2 or 3 years ago. And when those happened, the sports coaches from the big local community organisation, who were trusted by the kids, who spent all their time there, just went out and said, "Go home, don't get involved." And it was one of the few estates in that area that managed to avoid any participation in those riots. And what seems important there is less, that the mugger was protected, but more that the social fabric that was built around it protected the whole community. And I'm not sure that it matters whether it's a mugger or a skate park or a room for knit and natter, or, in the case of Ewanrig, a community right up in the far northwest of England with, on the edge of Maryport, which is the most remote town in England. There, one of the challenges in that community was every morning there would be a queue up the road by the GPs because there was nothing else to do on the housing estate. So that's what you did if you wanted to chat. You'd go to the GPs to chat, which cost a lot of money and wasn't very good for those who needed to go to the GP. And the community there put a room just up the road with a teapot or a kettle and a teapot and some mugs, and let people just go there, and that's where they all went. The queue went away at the GPs. So it might be interesting for Wes Streeting as he thinks about how to get over challenges to the NHS, because actually what people fundamentally wanted was not being medicalised. They wanted human connection, and actually by getting human connection, they probably avoided a lot of the symptoms that otherwise would have led to them genuinely needing to get medical help. So for me, it's less the exact thing. It's the presence of stuff in communities. Communities that have been stripped of stuff do way worse than communities that have got stuff. And, when you identify your new, generation of social fabric, the problem is that these are places that are, as you pointed out, they're expensive to get to, that often charge an entry fee. And what that means is that those that have access to something that's a fundamental to living a good life, social connection and social capital, those who have access to funds get that and those who don't. And that, that compounds on top of things like access to grants. Again, the communities in areas that have got lots of charities get loads of money because charities bring that money in. How do we crack that? I think we probably need to, return to a place-based approach to policy, whether that's at a combined authority or a local authority or a national level. And we need to start to think about what the things are that any community needs to prosper. And, foundational economists talk about, electricity and water and roads, all the things that are important to a community, but actually social fabric, social infrastructure. And I think you are probably the person who brought it back as a term, it became a fashionable term after you wrote about it, is something that ought to be viewed as a community necessity and ought to be funded in that way. I don't think we ought to have to think about clever, sustainable business models which rely on reaching out to ever more exotic intermediaries to provide you with kind of some form of really cleverly structured debt, when actually what you need to do is come up with policies that accept that a priority has to be recapitalising social fabric of all sorts, particularly in deprived communities, and treat that with the same priority that you would fixing the potholes, assuming they fix the potholes.
Yeah. No, thank you. We're determined to finish on time, not like those dreadful people in the last session. I'd like to open it up as well, but Ajaye, I don't know, just the one thing quickly on skate parks, and I think you know more about this than me, even if there might be others here that know more. The kind of two breeds of it, you've got the outdoor one where effectively anything goes and people can turn up and it's up for the community to effectively work out for itself who dominates and who uses it. The issue about being inclusive and the cost of it is if you have an indoor skate facility, actually then you can charge entry, it's managed by a commercial entity to some extent. That creates a barrier in terms of the cost, but then it allows that organisation to do things like thinking about, should we have a night that's just for girls, or is there a sort of a morning which is suitable for making it more... And that's the kind of two models there, right? And there's a trade-off. Is that something that, you could think about in terms of gyms or other issues? Those trade-offs seem like a difficult choice, right?
Yeah, I think that's it, isn't there? There's definitely a trade-off if you're talking about your breweries, if you're talking about different community centres. If they're privately run, then we can hope that actually purpose and impact is built into it, and we can have, well thought of plans in terms of inclusivity and stuff. When it's just a free-for-all park, then how do we ensure that becomes inclusive? In skate parks, generally, there is actually normally a charity that's based within that skate park. So there's normally a group of people that are running sessions and that are thinking along those lines. I don't know where... I run a private business. I don't know where I sit in terms of it. I think we need both. I think we need some community assets with the hope that then groups will come and take over them and ensure that, that there are trans groups that can come and have a session, and that we have groups based on people of colour, whatever it is, wheels groups and things. I think if we don't have the private companies who have just that little bit more money to be able to think about what are the long-term goals and what's the next sort of step in terms of inclusivity that we need to be thinking about, I think if we lose those, then we're not going to be continuing to go forward on that inclusive journey for ourselves in the first place. But I think it is a trade-off, and I think there's two things to consider, and that's with the hope that a private company is going to do the right things. And we know that they don't always.
For sure. I'd like to open it up for any questions and comments as well, I guess, or observations. But please, yes.
Hi, my name is Tatiana. I'm really interested in social infrastructure as well. I had a question about... I was watching essentially the old BBC archives, and I found this one video of these women in London that it was, I think, in the 50s or 60s that still had this like washing facilities, and they were talking about that it was kind of, I think, the last one in London, and they were shutting it down because people were getting washing machines in their homes and things like this, and really resonated with me of like kind of different types of social infrastructures that in the past that we have maybe lost. Maybe we don't want to totally bring back that, but Are there any, I guess, interesting, because we don't need to be, we don't need to be reinventing the wheel all the time. Are there any interesting social infrastructures that maybe you guys have seen maybe in the past that have kind of disappeared? For example, I know I'm from the US, and roller skating rinks are like so popular, and that's a place where a lot of kids go. So yeah, are there any kind of social infrastructures that in the past that we maybe lost that you've kind of were like, wow, I didn't know that existed, or something like this?
Yeah, really interesting. Two things I would mention. So we had a session similar to this at StirToAction Festival last year in Manchester, and one of the panellists was from Kitty's Laundrette, and that's not quite the same as the traditional sort of shared community washing space you're talking about, but it is in that sort of category of, laundrettes are a thing we used to have, we don't have them anymore, they're dying out. And actually, Kitty's Laundrette is a sort of modern incarnation of that continues that spirit, but maybe does it in a way that feels a bit more somehow modern and, maybe exciting to the community in some way. The thing it's not really an answer to your question, but I'm now sort of always looking out for what are these new community spaces and what are the new categories. And the one that keeps coming up recently, which I think is also problematic in other ways, but really good, is people seem to be talking a lot about community saunas now as a thing. So in the last year or two, suddenly you've got 10, 20, 30, even just around the Bristol area. And that, now, is that going to become a new thing? Is that going to be an inclusive, open thing that people can engage with? Or is it going to be a kind of refuge for certain types of people with money and with access again? But yeah, so I'm kind of trying to keep a tune for these new ones emerging, but others in the audience I'm sure will have a sense of it.
I studied in Sweden, so
okay.
It's very popular there, like pretty much everywhere. But there was another interesting thing, I guess, related to the future, and that was, there was a group of, I know in Copenhagen, for example, they were trying to kind of create these social infrastructures that were like waste centers as well. So like in kind of communities, they were trying to co-design kind of these, come and take your electronic waste, but it also has this social aspect. So, yeah.
I think the one that I was thinking of that's died out is internet cafes. That was a great great space to get some fast internet. So I'm based in Oxford, and in Oxford the waterways open up, and people go outdoors and do open swimming, and you get so many teenagers. The ones that I'd imagine if we lived at the beach would be able to go surfing all the time, but they're out there and they're just having a fantastic time, and it's free, and they can all socialise, and they're getting those connections that we were talking about. The other thing that we see in Oxford is just community litter picks. So people just going out there with a purpose, but again, getting that connection as well.
I think that idea of new stuff is important. I think we need to not just look at new social infrastructure, we also need to think about new communities, and we've just got a new government which has been elected with a mission, it seems, to build some more new towns, to have some significant urban extensions. And I think something that's going to be incredibly important as those are built is planning in that social fabric. Sometimes you can get over-fixated on preserving the existing community centre. Ralph here is proudly, curating a community centre that's been in the heart of his estate for probably 50 or 60 years, has a central heating system to match. It's probably the last surviving element of social fabric on an estate which has lost the butcher, which lost the baker, which lost the cafes, all the other sort of social fabric stuff, and we need to acknowledge that stuff is fabric as well. But as we build the new stuff, what's the new stuff we need to build? I think that might be your next bit of research.
Yeah, I mean, that's a lot of people's problems with volume house building is, they've built all these houses, but they haven't put in and no one's not quite sure what that something is, a community centre, what's the thing that's also not just housing in that space.
There are people down in this neck of the woods, I guess Sovereign Network Group are quite a big housing association. They probably have, about 180,000 homes or something, and they're building some big urban extensions in the south, the west, southwest, and they're thinking about models for, say, community centre building, where they don't just build them, but they find some way in the financing of the new developments to build the community organisation that will then take it into the long term. And that's not, you can't do that quickly. You need to commit yourself. All these people arrive in new homes from all over and plonk themselves in a community. How do you turn that from a dormitory into a thriving community? That needs more than just contracts to mow the lawns. You need to think about a new form of community development to help those new places thrive. And that probably went without saying when you were creating garden cities like Letchworth 50 or 60 years ago. There's a heritage foundation whose job it was to do that. Yes. How do we do that again this time around?
Yeah. Cool. So, Dan, my question is, I think the work that you've been doing, the distinction between this old infrastructure and the new is a really useful kind of way of framing things. There are some things that kind of fall in between that maybe are old infrastructure but have been reinvented. And I think a great example is libraries. So you look at some libraries and they're kind of the old model, they're kind of dying a death, partly because there's no funding, partly because they just don't appeal to the community anymore. You look at libraries like Dalston in North London, absolutely buzzing with young people going there to study. They've always got a cafe, a social space. My question, I guess, is I'm really reluctant to kind of put libraries into community ownership because I think the government should be funding them, but at the same time, I know the government aren't funding them. So I guess my question is there a kind of hybrid model that we can look at where libraries aren't going to close down every week, but at the same time, we're not just reliant on a kind of useless government?
Yeah, no, thank you. I mean, I'm not going to pretend to answer, and I don't think we should just try and answer every question. There were a couple of hands up, so do you want to go around and then maybe we can try and respond to any other points? There's other hands at the back there. Have you got the mic at the back? Yeah, brilliant.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the presentation today. A bit of a different point. I started off in this kind of work running adventure playgrounds, which used to exist all over the place. Now, you can have opinions on this, but one of the things that led to the demise of adventure playgrounds was health and safety legislation. I don't want to say that is bad, but I do think that it's part of a focus on what we can't do than what we can do. And there are a lot of barriers that stop people just going out and doing things. The spaces to set up adventure playgrounds are the same now as they were 40, 50 years ago. They could be there, but they're just not. And one of the things is the fear of litigation in just going out and doing things. And it strikes me that that is a factor in some of the things that we used to do where we would just get up and do it. We don't because of the fears of what could go wrong. And that seems to me to be a shame. How the hell we turn that round, I have absolutely no idea. I just wanted to add that to the mix.
I think it's a great point. When Dan and I were preparing for this conversation, one of my frustrations was actually that adventure playgrounds had become privatised. That all of a sudden I need to spend £15 at a national trust to take my children to an adventure playground to gain the benefits of it. So I think it's a great point. I also run a business that teaches skateboarding and boxing, so I'm completely wrapped up in risk assessments and accident forms just in my inbox all the time. I don't have the answer, but but I completely agree.
Yeah. There's another hand just at the back. Was it? Yeah, keep going. Just got a few minutes.
Hi, my name's Pippa and I'm from Whitley in Plymouth, so one of the big locals that Matt was talking about. And I just think it's a really interesting idea coming from an estate that doesn't have a lot of infrastructure, and because of master planning in communities means that we have struggled to put the infrastructure in for the future. And I think I still struggle with that tension between how land acquisition happens, local authorities hold those lands and the powers, and how we can give that power back to the communities for those communities and those estates and those places that people need to be, remain adaptable to the communities and people as they live and they move forward. And I don't really know what the answer is, but I think it's not always talked about how you create spaces and you need to keep them adaptable to where those people are and not have it in an aspect.
And maybe last one, is it John at the back? And then we'll close up.
John Goodman here with various hats, but this particular one is around housing and local community campaigning in Coventry, where I live. It's not just about urban expansion and urban extension, picking up that aspect of this debate. It's about city centres. We're having most of our post-war pioneering city centre demolished and replaced by housing. And I don't think the question of social infrastructure has really been part of that debate at all. So I want to know how we influence the influencers in those kind of city centre type redevelopment debates where the cost of land is higher and the whole kind of political and economic stakes seem to be much higher.
Thank you, John. Matt, do you want to respond, and then AJ, and then we'll close up. But thank you for your comments, and lots of them we don't have answers to, right? But that's, it's a battle for the future.
I think there's a common theme to all of those questions, which is around the attitude of local government to, enabling, harnessing, promoting the role of communities and the dynamism that they can bring to tackling all sorts of issues. Not least building social capital, which is, as I started saying, was right at the heart of resolving a lot of the challenges that we collectively face. You can see local authorities that are very good at it. Wigan went from claiming to be all about communities to actually really walking the walk now. They hand over assets to community organisations rather than sell them, because they recognise that the few £100,000 they might make from flogging a building is like nothing compared to the opportunity cost that goes when it just becomes a few more houses, and stuff that could happen simply doesn't. But it's not easy. There are lots of local authorities that are risk averse. There are lots of authorities that would take risks on communities but suffer from a loss of bandwidth because they're so embattled by everything else. But I think, when you look at the growth of organisations like New Local, which take a community-focused approach to tackling the problems that local government faced, you see that actually, slowly there's a sense that people are getting it. I think COVID helped a bit on that journey. And I think also the personal experience of senior local authority officers who, when, faced with no longer being able to just top-down direct stuff, are having to go out on the streets and learn more about the places in which they're working. I was talking to a chief executive of a northern local authority who said that he constantly thinks about the fact that he can walk between two wards which are equally deprived on the face of it, but in one it's thriving with community organisations and activity, and all you need to do is provide a small amount of money or a room or broker a relationship, and stuff just happens, and the community is better as a result of it. And then you go to the next community, which would seem to be exactly the same, but nothing's happening, there's nowhere for people to go, and people are slumped at home waiting for stuff to be done to them, and all the failure costs that mount up and are crippling local government fall on the local authority in that ward. So the challenge for him is, how do you reinvigorate, how do you create vibrant society in a place where, for all sorts of reasons, it's disappeared? And it won't, sure, bringing in some private sector operators might make a difference, but fundamentally it's about changing the local culture. It's about investing over the very long term in community development to build people's confidence and potential. And I think also just believing it's possible. We talked a lot about social capital, didn't we? 20 years ago, when Robert Putnam was writing his original books about skittle alleys, and we're probably about due to have another really serious conversation about how we bring that back into the national and local policy space.
Yeah. Thank you, Matt. AJ, any final thoughts?
I won't answer on that, but I'll signpost you to a gentleman in the middle there called Andy, who's part of Make Space and is doing some awesome things in Oxford city centre. You can put your hand up. Who is certainly going to be part of sort of regenerating the city centre in Oxford and opening that up to people who should have access to it.
Well, thank you very much both. I really appreciate your time and your wisdom, and thank you all for your comments and questions and your patience with us. So, thank you all.